I reached the trailhead just as the first line of sunlight cracked open the sky, but instead of hope, I was greeted by a sound that felt like a knife dragging across my chest. The metallic clank of a brand new HOA padlocked gate. It stood tall, silver, and hostile, blocking the only path that led into the woods where my daughter disappeared 3 weeks earlier. For a moment, I just stared at it, unable to breathe. My fingers trembled as I reached for the cold metal, and when I pulled, the gate didn't budge. Every instinct in me broke loose. I grabbed the bars with both hands and shook them violently until my arms burned, yelling her name into the empty morning air as if she might answer from the other side. The panic washed over me in a heavy, suffocating wave, dragging me straight back to the night she vanished. I could still hear her footsteps on the porch, the way she paused before leaving, turning to say, "Dad, don't wait up. I'll be back by 10. I remembered laughing, telling her I always waited up. I didn't know that would be the last time I'd hear her voice. I didn't know 10 o'clock would come and go, and I'd be pacing the living room, checking my phone every 2 minutes. I didn't know the woods behind our neighborhood, woods she walked through hundreds of times, would swallow her whole. And I didn't know the HOA, of all people, would do everything in their power to stop me from finding her. But maybe I should have known. Linda Hawthorne, our HOA president, had warned me a week earlier, her voice dripping with that polished superiority she used like a weapon. "Michael, the woods are off limits for residents, unless accompanied by an HOA-approved escort. It's in the bylaws." I remembered staring at her, trying not to explode as she smiled like she was doing me a favor by reminding me that my daughter's last known location was technically restricted. And when I put up search flyers around the community, she tore half of them down, claiming they created visual clutter and disturbed community aesthetics. That day at the gate, I felt something inside me snap. The HOA wasn't just obstructing me, they were actively blocking my search. My hands moved before my mind did. I dropped my backpack, grabbed the bolt cutters I'd brought with me almost out of desperation, and clamped down on the padlock. My heart pounded as metal bit into metal. I didn't care about fines. I didn't care about bylaws. I didn't care about Linda's endless threats. All I cared about was getting into those woods. That was when I sensed someone behind me. A soft crunch of gravel. I didn't turn at first, too focused on the lock, but then I felt eyes on me. I glanced back and saw a neighbor, camera raised, recording me like I was some kind of criminal breaking into government property. His expression wasn't concerned. It was curious, entertained. That was the moment the tension shifted. That was the moment I realized the HOA wasn't just hiding behind rules, they were hiding something else entirely. The kind of secret that made them panic at the thought of anyone stepping into those woods. I tightened my grip on the bolt cutters, ready to snap the lock once and for all. And then I heard it. A firm, low voice behind me. "Michael, you need to step away from that gate right now." By the time I walked back from the trailhead, my hands were still shaking from the confrontation and the unfinished threat hanging in the air. I hadn't even stepped onto my porch when I noticed something stuck to my front door. An oversized, overstuffed envelope with bold red letters stamped across the front. Urgent violation. My stomach dropped. I tore it off the door, half expecting it to be another petty notice about my lawn, but the weight of the envelope told me it was much, much worse. Inside were documents thick enough to feel like a legal textbook. Page after page of violations hit me in the face like punches. Public disturbance, vandalism, unauthorized presence in restricted HOA property. Each accusation felt like a deliberate twist of the knife. They even included printed stills from the neighbor's video, showing me holding the bolt cutters at the gate, as if capturing my desperation was some kind of victory for them. The fines totaled more than my mortgage payment. It was the HOA's way of saying, "Sit down. Shut up. Stop searching." I hadn't even processed the stack of charges when my phone buzzed with an incoming email. Another one from Linda Hawthorne herself. Her message was short, sharp, and dripping with that rehearsed authority she loved so much. "Your attempt to cut HOA property locks constitutes criminal intent. The board will not tolerate these actions. criminal intent. That was how she described me trying to access the place where my daughter might still be alive. I stood in my living room, holding the letter, feeling humiliation burn so hot behind my eyes I had to sit down. But humiliation quickly gave way to helplessness. And the moment I relived the night my daughter didn't come home, the night the sheriff first asked me if she had any reason to run away, the night I realized how fast a person can lose everything, I felt rage mix into the helplessness. A volatile, painful blend. I called for an emergency meeting with the HOA board. I didn't even care that Linda sat at the head of the table like a queen surveying her subjects. "My daughter is missing," I said, my voice cracking in a way I hated. "I cut the lock because that trail is the last place she was seen. I'm not vandalizing anything. I'm trying to find my kid." Silence. Not concern. Not empathy. Just the stiff, robotic repetition of scripted HOA rules. The woods are restricted. Search efforts must be coordinated through approved channels. Non-compliance triggers fines. They looked at me like I was an inconvenience they needed to process and dismiss. Then came the moment that chilled me deeper than anything else. Linda folded her hands and said, "Your emotional state is becoming a community safety concern. We have to consider the well-being of all residents, not just yours." The words hit me harder than any fine could. They weren't just stopping me. They were weaponizing my grief, my fear, my desperation. The part of me that should have been protected was now being used to paint me as unstable, dangerous, problematic. As the meeting adjourned, I felt emptied out, drained, defeated. But as I gathered my papers, one of the board members, a man who hadn't spoken once during the meeting, walked past me. He didn't look at Linda. He didn't look at the others. He looked straight at me. And as he stepped by, he slipped a small folded note into my hand. I opened it under the table. "Check the bylaws amendment from last month. Something isn't right." The morning after the violation meeting, I stepped outside with a stack of fresh flyers, hoping, maybe foolishly, that someone in the neighborhood might have seen something, anything, that could help. As I walked past the row of trimmed hedges lining Maple Ridge Lane, I heard hushed voices. Two neighbors standing on a porch, thinking I was far enough away not to notice. One of them whispered, "His breakdowns are bad for property values." The other muttered something about community image. For a moment, I froze mid-step. I didn't turn around, didn't confront them, didn't defend myself. I just kept walking, carrying the weight of their words like another brick on my chest. It stung in a way I wasn't prepared for, not because they doubted me, but because they reduced my daughter's disappearance to a real estate statistic. I spent the next few hours posting flyers on light poles, stop signs, and community boards. Each time I placed one, I smoothed the corners carefully, silently begging the universe for someone, anyone, to pay attention. But by sunset, half the flyers were already gone, torn off, peeled away, replaced with HOA-approved announcements about landscaping schedules or community wellness reminders. By the next morning, they all vanished completely, as if the neighborhood wanted to erase her existence just to avoid discomfort. That afternoon, I received yet another email from the HOA informing me that I'd been reported for solicitation. Solicitation. That's what they called handing out missing person flyers. The message warned me that further unsanctioned distribution of materials would result in additional fines. I felt the anger rise again, but beneath it was something heavier. Exhaustion, the kind that makes your shoulders sag and your voice fade. Still, I refused to stop. The neighborhood felt split down the middle. Some residents avoided eye contact completely, rushing indoors the moment they saw me, afraid the HOA might take note of them. Showing sympathy, a few offered quiet nods or quick hand squeezes, like they wanted to help but didn't dare. And then there were those who watched me like I was a problem that needed cleaning up. The entire community felt tense, suffocating, like a place where grief was treated as a violation. But that note the board member slipped me. That was the one thread I could still pull. So that night, after the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the streetlights flickered to life, I sat at my dining table with my laptop open and the bylaws PDF glowing on the screen. Page after page looked familiar until I reached the amendment section. There it was. A new clause restricting access to the exact wooded area where my daughter disappeared. The language was vague but intentionally limiting. Residents prohibited. Patrols authorized only by HOA approval. Restricted zones marked for safety. It was almost too specific. I compared the timestamps with the county records. Something was off. According to the official timestamp, the amendment had been added less than a week after my daughter vanished. No community vote. No announcement. No email notification. It was slipped in quietly, almost secretly. My suspicion sharpened into something solid and cold. This wasn't just strict policy. It felt orchestrated, rushed, hidden. I zoomed in on the digital signature at the bottom. Linda Hawthorne. But the time and date on the signature didn't make sense. It claimed she signed the amendment late at night on a weekend she'd publicly boasted about being out of town for a charity retreat. My heart pounded as I stared at the timestamp. Why would Linda lie about where she was the night she restricted the woods? Something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. The morning after discovering Linda's suspicious signature, I drove straight to the county records office, a place that always smelled faintly of old paper and damp carpet. I barely slept. My mind replayed that timestamp over and over. Linda claiming she was out of town, while the bylaws showed her approving a restriction on the very woods where my daughter vanished. Something didn't add up, and the longer I sat in that parking lot, the more a sickening dread settled into my gut. Inside, the clerk behind the counter looked at me with polite disinterest as I requested all filings connected to Maple Ridge Estates HOA. She typed without urgency, completely unaware that every second felt like a lifetime to me. When she finally handed me the folder, I practically snatched it and hurried to a nearby table. My hands shook as I flipped through the documents, financial records, landscaping filings, meeting minutes. Then I found it. The amendment restricting access to the woods. Except something was wrong. The amendment wasn't stamped by the county recorder's office. There was no filing number, no date of public posting, no community vote record. In fact, it wasn't recorded anywhere in the county system at all. In HOA law, especially in states like ours, amendments must follow a very rigid process. They must be publicly posted, voted on by homeowners, and officially filed. None of that had happened. It was illegal. This wasn't oversight or clerical error. It was deliberate. I flipped to the page with the signature. Linda's name glared back at me, her authority scrawled in thick ink, but not a single supporting document backed it up. And when I checked the timeline, the realization hit me like a punch to the chest. The restriction was put in place only 5 days after my daughter disappeared. 5 days. Why would the HOA rush a secret amendment right after a teenage girl went missing? Why lock down the woods instead of opening them for search efforts? Why hide the entire process from the county? The fear that had been growing inside me for weeks suddenly took shape. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about liability. The HOA wasn't just controlling, they were hiding something. The question was what? Fueled by anger and dread, I drove straight to the next HOA meeting. The room was packed with residents sitting stiffly in folding chairs, papers neatly stacked in their laps. Linda sat at the head of the table, wearing her signature power suit, her smile tight and performative. When she saw me enter, her expression tightened, but she continued speaking as if nothing were wrong. I waited until the floor opened for comments, then stood. My voice trembled, but not from fear. This time it was fury. Why wasn't the Woods Amendment filed with the county? I asked, holding up the unfiled papers. Why did you sign it the same weekend you told the entire neighborhood you were out of town? A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Linda didn't flinch. She simply gave a dismissive smile and said, "Michael, this is not the time or place for conspiracy theories. Please sit down." I tried to push further, but she slammed the gavel so hard the sound echoed like a gunshot through the room. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared before anyone else could speak. The board members shuffled quickly, avoiding eye contact. The residents dispersed in uncomfortable silence. I stood there gripping the papers, heart pounding, feeling like I'd just been shoved back into the dark. I was about to leave, defeated again, when I felt a presence behind me. A figure stepped forward. Uniformed, calm, authoritative. A deputy. He looked me dead in the eyes and said quietly, "We need to talk about your HOA." The deputy who approached me after the HOA meeting introduced himself as Deputy Chris Miller, a steady-looking man whose expression told me he wasn't here for small talk. He motioned for me to step outside with him, away from the cluster of curious neighbors who lingered around the meeting hall like moths near a porch light. The cool air hit my face as we walked into the parking lot, and before I could even ask what this was about, Chris spoke. "Michael," he said, lowering his voice, "I need you to know something. The HOA, they denied us access to search the woods." For a moment, the world around me seemed to tilt. "Denied you," I repeated, barely recognizing my own voice. "You're the sheriff's office. How can they deny you anything?" "They can't," he replied, jaw tightening, but that didn't stop them from trying. "Linda told us the area was restricted due to liability issues and claimed the HOA couldn't allow law enforcement onto privately maintained common property without a formal waiver. It was nonsense, of course, but it slowed us down. It created confusion. And in missing person cases, confusion costs time." My shock quickly boiled into anger so sharp it made my hands tremble. They hadn't just blocked me, they had blocked trained search teams who could have found my daughter days earlier. "So while I was out there begging for help, they were shutting you out too?" Chris nodded. "Your HOA is unusually territorial. But this level of interference? This is something else." The anger inside me surged into something darker, something close to hatred. I could accept paperwork delays, meetings, even fines. But to obstruct law enforcement during a search? It was unthinkable. Chris studied my face for a long moment, then asked, "Did your daughter have any conflicts with the HOA? Or with any board members?" At first, I shook my head automatically. But then a memory surfaced, uninvited and unsettling. A few weeks before she vanished, my daughter came home frustrated, tossing her backpack onto the kitchen counter. She told me she had a run-in with Linda during a community cleanup event. My daughter had joined a youth environmental club at school and suggested clearing a section of the woods' overgrown trail. According to her, Linda shut her down instantly, claiming it was not an area for children to explore, and lectured her for 10 straight minutes about liability exposure. My daughter had rolled her eyes dramatically when she told me, calling Linda the queen of no. At the time, I brushed it off as a typical teenage complaint about authority. Now it felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place, a piece I never realized mattered. "I don't know if it was a conflict," I finally said, "but she and Linda clashed. It wasn't serious, or at least I didn't think it was." Chris let out a slow breath, staring toward the dark outline of the woods in the distance. "Your HOA president has a habit of shutting down anything involving those trails. Too fast, too aggressively. And now, with everything else we're seeing, I'm starting to wonder why." My pulse quickened. The fear I'd been trying to swallow for weeks rose again, but this time it came with something else. A terrible curiosity. A sense that the truth wasn't just close. It was approaching like a storm. Chris looked at me with an expression halfway between caution and urgency. "Michael," he said, "there's something else you need to see." And from the tone of his voice, I knew whatever he was about to show me would change everything. Chris didn't say another word as he led me to his patrol vehicle parked along the curb. He opened the passenger door and reached inside, pulling out a slim manila folder and a USB drive sealed in an evidence bag. The seriousness in his eyes made my stomach knot. Whatever he was about to show me, it wasn't routine. It wasn't even borderline normal. "We recovered this during our preliminary search," he said, tapping the evidence bag. "These are files from the HOA's trail cameras." I blinked at him. Trail cameras? Linda told the HOA there weren't any cameras in the woods. Chris let out a humorless huff. She lied. The words struck like a slap to the face. A lie about cameras near the exact place my daughter disappeared. A lie told confidently, repeatedly, without hesitation. The implications made my skin crawl. Chris handed me the folder, and inside were printed snapshots, screenshots taken from corrupted footage, static-filled, distorted, time-stamped. She said the cameras were old and never worked, Chris continued, but these were recorded the night your daughter went missing. Every single file from that evening is either damaged or missing entirely. My pulse hammered. How many cameras? 5, he said. Every one of them points toward the wooded area behind your neighborhood, and every one of them cut out between 9:12 p.m. and 10:03 p.m., the exact window we believe your daughter disappeared. I stared at the images. Lines of static, black frames, skip time, deliberate deletions, if I had to guess. But then there was one frame, one that hadn't been completely corrupted, a partial image, the top half covered in digital noise, but the lower half unmistakable. A pair of work boots, a uniform, an HOA maintenance badge dangling from a belt loop. Is that? I started. Chris nodded. That's one of your HOA maintenance workers. Appears he was near the woods just before the footage cuts off. He didn't log any work orders that night. No maintenance was scheduled, no patrols assigned. A chill tore its way down my spine. So he was there without reason. Or, Chris said carefully, he was there for a reason. One someone didn't want us to know about. My mouth went dry. Do you think the HOA tampered with the footage? Chris sighed. I can't make accusations yet. But missing footage during a missing person investigation, cameras denied to law enforcement, HOA leadership lying about their existence? He closed the folder, his expression firm. It's more than suspicious, a lot more. I leaned against his patrol car, trying to keep my breathing steady. The ground felt unsteady beneath me, as if every revelation was prying loose the foundations of everything I thought I knew. If the HOA was hiding footage, what else were they hiding? How far would they go to keep the truth buried? Chris placed a hand on my shoulder. We're following the digital trail. But the moment whoever did this realizes we're onto them, they might panic. Be careful, Michael. Someone in your HOA is hiding something big. As he drove away, leaving me alone under the streetlights, the night felt heavier than usual. My neighborhood suddenly seemed darker, quieter, almost watchful. I carried the folder inside my house and locked the door behind me, checking the windows out of instinct. Hours later, just as I started to drift into an uneasy, restless sleep, there came a frantic knock at my front door. Sharp, rapid, desperate. I opened it to find the HOA maintenance worker from the footage standing on my porch. His hands were shaking, his voice even more so. The maintenance worker, his name was Evan. I realized only because of the faded badge clipped crookedly to his shirt, stood on my porch trembling like he'd run the whole way to my house. His eyes darted around the street, checking the shadows, checking the windows, checking everything except me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. They're watching you, he said. They know you've been talking to the sheriff. The words sent a cold spike down my spine. Who's watching me? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The board, he said. Linda, some of the others. They told us to keep an eye on you. I stared at him, stunned and disgusted. Keep an eye on me? Why? What do they think I'm doing besides trying to find my daughter? Evan flinched at the sharpness in my voice, but instead of backing away, he stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. They ordered me to secure certain cameras before law enforcement got involved. Cameras near the woods. Cameras they said were malfunctioning. My pulse jumped. Secure them how? I pressed. Evan swallowed hard. Make sure no one accessed the original files. Delete some of the corrupted ones. Pull a hard drive before officers saw it. He ran a shaking hand through his hair, pacing across my porch. I didn't delete anything, I swear. But they think I did. And if they find out I didn't, I'll lose my job. Maybe worse. His fear felt real, raw, but fear alone didn't absolve him. Why come to me now? I asked. Why show up in the middle of the night? Because, he said, voice cracking under pressure, I saw the footage before the files disappeared. I saw who was out there that night, and I saw your daughter. My knees went weak. What do you mean you saw her? I can't say here, he whispered. Not with the houses so close. I just needed you to know you're in danger if you keep pushing them. They don't want that night talked about. And now that the sheriff's involved, he cut himself off at the sound of a passing car. He backed toward the steps like he expected someone to leap out of the shadows and drag him away. I shouldn't have come. Just keep your head down. Before I could stop him, he hurried down the walkway and disappeared between the parked cars, leaving me with 100 unanswered questions and a creeping dread that wrapped around my ribs like ice. But the night wasn't done with me. Around 2 a.m., something slammed against the side of my house, hard enough to jolt me out of bed. I rushed outside with a flashlight and found my backyard fence smashed inward, wooden planks cracked and splintered. At the base of the broken boards lay a single sheet of paper with blocky letters scrawled across it. Stop digging. The threat was unmistakable, cruel, calculated, and the HOA wasted no time twisting it into another attack. By noon, I'd received an email blaming me for deliberately damaging my own property to create community disturbance. They issued yet another violation, this one for property neglect, as if the smashed fence was a landscaping issue. It was no longer just obstruction. It was intimidation, retaliation, a message sent in the dark. But late that evening, as I sat at the edge of my torn fence replaying everything in my head, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was Evan. His message was short, urgent. Meet me tomorrow. I have the footage. Evan chose a rundown picnic area behind the old elementary school for our meeting spot, far from the HOA's jurisdiction, far from the wandering eyes of neighbors, far from anything that might make him bolt in panic. When I arrived, he was already there, pacing in tight circles like a man whose nerves had been stretched too thin for too long. The moment he saw me, he lifted a trembling hand and motioned for me to join him behind a row of untrimmed hedges. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. His fingers shook so badly he nearly dropped it. This is what I didn't delete, he whispered. What they told me to erase. What Linda said would cause unnecessary chaos. I stared at the flash drive like it was radioactive. You're sure this has the recordings? He nodded. Some of them. Not all. They made me wipe the main server, but I copied what I could before they checked the logs. His eyes darted toward the street as if Linda herself might materialize at any second. She said if I didn't erase the files, she'd claim I was stealing HOA property. She said she'd ruin me. My jaw tightened. The lengths she was willing to go just to hide what happened in those woods made my stomach churn. What's on here? I asked. Evan swallowed. A meeting. Late at night. The night your daughter disappeared. Who was meeting? He took a shaky breath. Linda. And someone else. I don't know who. The clip is damaged, but you can see her waiting near the restricted trail sign. She checks her phone. She keeps looking toward the woods, and then the other person arrives. They talk, they argue, and then… He hesitated, voice trembling. Then the camera cuts out. My breath hitched. Why were they even out there? I don't know. But Linda didn't want anyone to see it. That much I'm sure of. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, gripping it tightly. I'm taking this to Deputy Miller. At the sheriff's substation, Chris listened in silence as I explained everything. His face hardened when I placed the flash drive on his desk. She ordered a cover-up, he muttered. That's obstruction, plain and simple. I added quietly. She threatened him, pressured him, forced him to erase evidence. Chris nodded slowly. If that's true, she's crossed a line. While the drive uploaded, I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. The truth was close. I could feel it like a tremor under my feet. But with every step closer, the danger around me seemed to thicken. As the corrupted clip finally appeared on Chris's monitor, my chest tightened. Despite the static and distortion, Linda's figure was unmistakable, standing rigid near the restricted trail sign, her posture tense, her head snapping toward the woods every few seconds. Then another person approached, face partially obscured by a hood. They exchanged words that the camera's damaged microphone couldn't catch, but the argument was obvious. Their hands cut through the air sharply, their movements sharp, urgent, and then the playback stopped, glitching into a streak of white noise. Chris leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "This is enough," he said. "Enough to request search warrants, enough to pull digital records, enough to hold her for questioning." For the first time in weeks, I felt a pulse of hope. Faint, fragile, but real. Chris reached for his phone, preparing the documentation needed to escalate the case. Before he could finish, his phone rang. He answered, and his expression shifted instantly. His eyes lifted to mine. "Michael," he said, voice grim. "We found something in the woods." The next HOA meeting was already tense before I even stepped inside. Word had spread about the deputies in the neighborhood, about the renewed search, about something found in the woods. People huddled in clusters around the folding chairs, whispering with wide, anxious eyes. Some looked at me with sympathy. Others looked at me with suspicion, as if my determination to find my daughter had somehow dragged the entire community into chaos. But nothing prepared anyone for what happened next. Just as Linda raised her gavel to begin the meeting, the back door swung open and two uniformed deputies stepped inside, followed by Deputy Chris Miller. The room fell into stunned silence. Linda froze, her face draining of color. When Chris announced they were there to retrieve HOA digital property for an active investigation, she didn't even attempt composure. She bolted. The entire room watched as the HOA president, prim, polished, self-appointed queen of Maple Ridge, sprinted toward her office like a cornered animal. One of the deputies moved to block her path, and for a moment, she stood there trembling, pulse visibly pounding at her throat. "This is harassment," she shouted. "You have no authority here. This is a private meeting." But Chris was calm, cold, precise. "Ma'am, obstructing an active investigation is a criminal offense. Step aside." The room erupted, some shouting at her, some shouting at the deputies, others demanding answers. It felt like the pressure that had been building for weeks finally burst open, spilling fear, anger, and suspicion across every inch of that cramped room. While tensions escalated, Chris motioned for the AV volunteer to project the footage from the flash drive onto the screen. The volunteer hesitated, glancing nervously at Linda. Chris reassured him. "It's official evidence now. Go ahead." When the distorted trail footage appeared on the screen, the static, the timestamp, the unmistakable silhouette of Linda waiting near the restricted trail, the room exploded again. Gasps, shouts, people standing from their chairs demanding explanations. The HOA board members sat pale and rigid, their carefully constructed image crumbling like wet cardboard. Linda stepped forward, voice shrill and shaking. "This is taken out of context. I was conducting an authorized inspection. The board knew about it." The board members looked at her as if she'd set their houses on fire. One muttered, "We didn't approve anything." Another whispered, "She told us the cameras didn't work." But Linda wasn't done. She pointed at me next. "This man has been unstable for weeks," she screamed. "He's twisting everything to target me. This is harassment. This is slander. He's dangerous." A few residents murmured in agreement, but most recoiled at her desperation. Even those who had once feared her authority now saw panic dripping from every word she spoke. Deputies moved past her, seizing laptops, USB drives, binders, and the main HOA server box. Linda lunged as if to stop them, but Chris stepped in her path, blocking her with a calm firmness that made her recoil. "This is obstruction," he said. "Do not interfere again." The room finally quieted. Residents watched in heavy silence as the HOA's digital skeleton was carried out piece by piece. I felt numb watching it happen. Not victorious, not relieved. Just hollow. Like every step forward only led to a deeper, darker place I wasn't prepared for. As Chris prepared to leave, another deputy leaned in and whispered something into his ear. Chris's expression shifted immediately. Tight, urgent, grim. He turned to me. "Michael," he said quietly, "you'll want to see this." He hesitated, lowering his voice further. "It's about the sinkhole reports." Chris led me into a small conference room inside the sheriff's substation, a room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and copier toner. A stack of folders sat on the table, each stamped with the HOA's name. He didn't sit. He didn't ease into the conversation. He simply opened the top folder and slid a document toward me. "Maintenance reports," he said, dating back almost 8 years. I skimmed the first page, then stopped cold. It described a sinkhole risk assessment, specifically in the wooded area behind Maple Ridge, the exact area where my daughter disappeared. I flipped to the next page. Another report, another warning. Geologists urging repairs, contractors recommending barriers. Year after year, the same warnings repeated, growing more urgent with each entry, but the final note on every single report was identical. No action taken, deferred by HOA. My throat tightened. "They knew," I whispered. "They knew the ground out there wasn't safe." Chris nodded grimly. "Your HOA ignored every professional recommendation. They didn't want to pay for repairs. It would have cost tens of thousands of dollars, money they didn't want to raise in dues. Residents would have been angry, board elections would have changed, and Linda wasn't about to risk losing control." Another folder slid my way. Photos this time. Sections of the trail where the ground sagged unnaturally, dips hidden beneath fallen leaves and overgrown brush. The kind of hazard that wouldn't look dangerous until someone stepped in the wrong place. "She may have fallen near one of these," Chris said quietly. "Maybe twisted an ankle. Maybe lost her footing. Once she was off the trail, it would have been easy to get turned around." I clenched the edge of the table. "So instead of fixing it, they hid it. And when my daughter went missing, they doubled down," Chris finished. "They rushed that amendment to restrict access. They refused search teams. They lied about the cameras. Everything Linda did was about protecting the HOA from liability, not protecting people, not protecting your daughter." The room felt smaller, heavier. My vision narrowed, my pulse pounding like a drum in my ears. All the pieces clicked together in one horrifying chain: the secret amendment, the blocked searches, the missing footage, the threats. It wasn't a conspiracy born out of malicious intent toward my daughter. It was cowardice, negligence, fear. And that fear drove them to bury the truth under layers of lies. Chris leaned forward. "The moment a minor is hurt on HOA-managed property, especially due to a known hazard, they're responsible. That means lawsuits, criminal negligence, financial ruin." Linda did everything she could to keep that sinkhole quiet. My jaw clenched so tight it ached. She risked my daughter's life to protect a budget. "And her power," Chris added. "Don't underestimate that part." Outside the conference room, radios crackled and officers moved briskly between halls. Inside, the silence between me and Chris felt like a storm gathering strength. He placed a hand on the remaining folders. "We're sending teams to re-examine the area. Now that we know what we're dealing with, we can expand the search beyond the trail." I nodded numbly, heart torn between anguish and hope. "Do you think she's still—" Before I could finish, a knock echoed against the door. A search team officer stepped inside, mud streaking his boots. "Deputy Miller," he said, urgency in his tone. "You need to come out to the site." Chris straightened. "What did you find?" The officer hesitated only a second before answering. "We found footprints. Fresh ones. Small ones. They lead away from the sinkhole area." He looked at me directly. "Sir, they might be your daughter's." The moment the officer said the word footprints, something inside me broke loose. Hope, fear, adrenaline, all twisting together until I could barely breathe. Chris and I followed him out of the station, and by the time we reached the wooded area, the sky was already shifting toward dusk, painting the trees in streaks of orange and fading gold. Search teams spread across the forest floor like an organized wave, radio chatter echoing through the brush. When I saw the footprints, small, uneven, trailing along the damp soil near the creek bed, my knees nearly buckled. They were real. They were recent, and they were leading away from the sinkhole danger zone. For the first time in weeks, the forest didn't feel like a place of dread. It felt like it was guiding me. She followed the water, one of the searchers said. Smart kid, creeks lead somewhere. We pushed deeper along the stream, its gentle trickle the only sound cutting through the pounding in my ears. And then, faint at first, almost imagined I heard it. A cough. I froze. Again, I whispered. Then came a small hoarse whimper. I sprinted before anyone could stop me, branches whipping against my arms, mud splashing beneath my shoes. And there she was, my daughter, curled beneath an overhang of tangled roots, her clothes dirty, her lips cracked, her face pale but unmistakably alive. Dad, she croaked. I fell to my knees beside her, pulling her into my arms as relief tore through me so violently I couldn't hold back the sob that escaped my chest. She was dehydrated, weak, scared, but she was breathing. She was alive. I held her as the paramedics rushed in, my hands shaking as if my entire body couldn't comprehend the reality of the moment. Relief washed through me, but with it came another emotion. One far darker. She survived in spite of them, in spite of every barrier the HOA put in place, in spite of every lie Linda told, in spite of the time lost because they refused to let us search sooner. She survived despite the people who were supposed to protect this community. As my daughter was carried toward the ambulance, Chris placed a hand on my shoulder. We got the warrants approved, he said. And after what we found in the digital records? Well, things are already in motion. I didn't have to ask what he meant. Hours later, as my daughter rested in the hospital, recovering under soft blankets and IV fluids, I received the call. Deputies had arrived at Linda's house. She answered the door still clinging to her usual superiority until they read her the charges. Obstruction of an investigation. Evidence tampering. Negligence resulting in endangerment. Her arrest rippled through the neighborhood like an earthquake. Residents gathered outside, watching as the woman who ruled over them with bylaws and intimidation was led away in handcuffs. No gavel, no clipboard, no power, just consequences. But the fallout didn't stop there. Once the sinkhole reports, missing footage, and illegal bylaw amendment came to light, the state launched a full-scale investigation into the entire HOA board. Financial documents were seized. Emails were subpoenaed. Board members lawyered up faster than they could form excuses. For the first time since this nightmare began, the balance of power shifted, not toward me, but toward the truth. Later that evening, as I stepped into the hallway outside my daughter's hospital room to gather myself, a state investigator approached, an older man with tired eyes and a voice that carried the weight of authority. Mr. Carter, he said, I've reviewed the preliminary findings. I braced myself. He looked me dead in the eyes. Your HOA wasn't just negligent, he said. It was criminal, and I realized the fight was far from over. A few weeks after everything came crashing down, the arrests, the investigations, the hearings, I stood at the entrance of Maple Ridge, watching something I once thought I'd never see. Two workers, contracted by the county, stood on ladders unbolting the massive wooden HOA sign that had towered over the community for years. It once felt imposing, like a reminder carved in timber that the HOA held the true power in our neighborhood. But today, the sign looked small, almost pathetic, as it was lifted off its posts and lowered to the ground with a dull, final thud. That sound felt like justice. The board had been formally dissolved, stripped of authority after state investigators confirmed the extent of the negligence, the cover-ups, and the deliberate obstruction. Every board member who played a role in hiding the sinkhole reports or tampering with evidence faced consequences, some legal, some financial, all deserved. And as word spread that the HOA would not return, the community seemed to exhale for the first time in years. Neighbors began to reclaim their independence. Kids rode bikes without being scolded. People planted gardens without fear of violation letters. The street felt alive again. For the first time in a long time, Maple Ridge belonged to its residents, not to signatures, bylaws, or power-hungry leadership. But for me, the real victory wasn't the fall of the HOA. It was walking into my kitchen in the morning and seeing my daughter sitting at the table, wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm tea. She was healing, slowly, cautiously, but healing nonetheless. The forest still haunted her. The nightmares still broke through some nights. And sometimes, when a loud noise cracked outside, she flinched. The scars were there, emotional ones, invisible ones, but she was here, alive, and I would spend the rest of my life helping her rebuild what was broken. As I watched that sign being hauled into a waiting truck, I thought about everything we'd been through. How close we came to losing everything because of people who valued liability avoidance over human life. How the systems meant to protect residents could be twisted into tools of control. And how far a parent is willing to go when the world stands between them and their child. And the lesson became painfully clear. You cannot let people in power convince you that your grief is an inconvenience. You cannot let rules replace compassion. And you cannot let fear silence you when your rights and your family are at stake. HOAs have authority, yes, but they do not have the right to bury the truth, intimidate residents, or weaponize bylaws to cause harm. And if they try, you fight. You push back. You dig until the truth can't stay buried another second. Standing there in the cool morning air, watching that sign disappear into the back of a truck, I finally felt the weight lift from my chest. Not completely, not forever, but enough. Enough to take the next step forward, and the next, and the next. Before leaving the entrance, I turned toward the camera, because this story, as painful as it was, wasn't just mine anymore. If you've ever dealt with an abusive HOA, or you've seen power twisted into something dangerous, tell your story. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Because the more we talk about these situations, the more people realize they're not alone. And trust me, there are more stories to tell. So before I go, let me ask you this. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? And are you ready for the next story?